Hello, Player One. Welcome to the Gaming History Club. My name is Gabby.
Hello, and I'm JP, and today we're talking about a gaming history hero who's often been overlooked. Despite them being the first video game writer, the creator of the strategy game genre, and as far as anyone's aware, the first female video game designer. Today, we'll talk about Mabel Addis. So, Player One, first of all, we do have to let you know we've got some news regarding how often we will be releasing episodes, and we'll be talking about that towards the end of the episode. So, yeah, please fast forward if you're not going to finish this episode, because it's quite important for us that you listen.
Yeah, that's true. And if you can't already hear it, Player One, I sound really weird because I'm not feeling well and I'm kind of losing my voice. So, JP will be doing the episode fully without me.
My condolences, Player One. I know I don't like it either. You're just gonna have to listen to me. It sucks for you.
I think Player One would be fine with that.
Well, we'll see about that.
But I think it's important to at least explain a little bit why do we choose Mabel Addis to be our gaming history hero to talk about today.
Right, because this was mainly your idea, this episode, so it's only right that you tell us what really initiated this episode today.
Yeah, I guess. So I was reading about early video game history and I was reading a bit about the edutainment side of video games from the Oregon Trail and the Sumerian Games. And of course, when reading into Sumerian Games, I bump into Mabel Addis.
And bump into is a great way of putting it because she has been overlooked, as we've just said as well. Yeah, it's
Absolutely.
very hard to find stuff about her, especially only the last 3, 4, 5 years have people actually figured out, wow, this was a pivotal person that we haven't really discussed before.
I know, that's true. And it was just so impressive how difficult it was, as you made the point just now, to find any information about Mabel. And I'm like, okay, you know what? We definitely have to talk about her, right?
Right.
Yeah, but anyway, JP will get into all of that and talk about all of the impressive stuff about Mabel Addis. So anyway, I will bow out and let JP continue the episode.
What she means is she'll be supervising me for anything stupid that I might say, Player One. But that's okay.
Okay, well, take it away, JP.
Right, so one thing I also wanted to say is we don't actually talk about the very early video game history a lot, so that's anything that came before Pong. So people often think Pong is the start of video games, and it kind of is in like a pragmatic, practical way. Technically, there was one arcade game before Pong made by Atari, so yeah, it's not true, and people played video games before arcade machines as well. It's just that they weren't for us normal people. They were all in university labs and what have you. So it's a very great chance to go back to, what should be our bread and butter as the Gaming History Club, like going really far back in time. And it's a super interesting place to be at. So this is going to be some really cool stuff we'll be talking about today. Something I did want to preempt and say right from the start is Mabel is important to video game history, not just because, she was the first video game writer or the first female video game designer. Her story matters because the game she designed, with the programming help of William McKay, the Sumerian Game, was mind-bogglingly ahead of its time. This is years before anyone even used the term video game. I mean, this is 8 years before Pong. Mabel is important to us because she introduced ideas we now take completely for granted, including telling a story through playing video games. A brand new thing, and it's thanks to her we got that. So before we get into the Sumerian Game and all of that, let's talk about Mabel herself, because after all, we've named this episode after her. So who was Mabel Addis then? She was born Mabel Lorraine Holmes on May 21st, 1912, which means she could have easily been our great-grandmother, and also yours, Player One, if you're in your mid-30s like me and Gabby are. So she was born in Mount Vernon, New York, and you can think of that as being around 20 miles north of Manhattan, sitting just above the Bronx. Her father was James Holmes, and he owned a building supply company, and her mother, also named Mabel, was a homemaker. And growing up, Mabel, and I mean the daughter, not the mother, she dreamed of going to Greece and becoming an archaeologist. And she had a real love for history and storytelling, which in hindsight isn't all that surprising considering she would later introduce storytelling to video games. So she didn't just dream big from an early age, though. She was also a very highly academic achiever, and she graduated valedictorian from Brewster High School in 1929. So, for anyone outside of the US, what is that? Well, the valedictorian is basically this top student with the best exam scores that likely gave a speech during graduation. Similar to Dustin from Stranger Things Season 5, he was the valedictorian, if you're wondering what that is. It's basically Dustin from Stranger Things. But despite Mabel's early academic achievements, her mother, on the other hand, didn't like the idea of her becoming an archaeologist in Greece. And, well, the easy excuse here was that it was simply too expensive, of course. But the real reason? Well, a career as an archaeologist in a faraway country was considered impractical for a woman in those days, right? So expectations from her family and society in general steered Mabel towards a more practical career path. So this is always a little bit painful to talk about. You got young dreams being reshaped like this. Especially when this person is doing so well in school, which is about the only control you have about, where you're going in life personally. Though, hey, at least it got us gamers like a lot of good stuff in the end, so yay. Anyway, after graduating high school in 1929, Mabel went on to study at Barnard College in New York, and that's part of Columbia University, which was even then considered a highly prestigious institution. So by 1933, she had earned a degree in ancient history with a minor in psychology. But for her graduate studies, however, she slightly changed course, so she completed her master's degree in education at Columbia University. So you could argue that this wasn't far removed from her early dreams of becoming an archaeologist in Greece, but it is also a textbook example of how young women's ambitions were often reshaped into what society deemed to be acceptable for women, and these were the so-called pink-collar jobs for women in 20th century America. These were roles which were either seen as domestic or nurturing or administrative, so teachers, nurses, librarians, secretaries, telephone operators, this is what was deemed acceptable for a woman, not going to a foreign country and becoming an archaeologist. After Mabel earned her master's degree in education in the mid-1930s, she began her professional career as a teacher, and that career would actually span 5 decades, her entire working life actually. But it's worth pausing here just to highlight some of her milestones as well, because this part of her life truly matters so much to really understand how the Sumerian game came to be, because this isn't trivial information whatsoever. So, she started teaching in 1935 at a very tiny one-room school. And in 1942, she married Alexander Addis, and now she actually became Mabel Addis, as we know her. And in 1950, she moved to the Katona-Lewisboro School District, where she would teach until her retirement much later in 1976. So let's talk about the school district. This became a huge part of her life and also an identity as a teacher. Today, the Katona-Lewisboro district has 5 schools. There's 3 elementary schools, there's a middle school, and a high school. But Mabel taught at the Katona Elementary School. Anyway, if you're wondering where this is exactly, this is still in New York State, but this is over 50 miles away from Manhattan, so this is not a big city place at all. Quite the opposite, actually. Like Katona, for example, is a tiny village which even today has a population of under 2,000 people. But that small school district, its pupils, and the wider community there are all important details in Mabel's story of designing the Sumerian game, and we'll get into that very shortly. But before we do, and so we don't jump back and forth between the story of Mabel as a person and the Sumerian game as a game, let's just talk a little bit more about her unique qualities as well as a person. We talked a little bit about her career, like the things you can read on her resume or CV. Let's talk a little bit about what made her unique as a person as well. Mabel showed real ambition in pursuing her curiosity, and she had the intelligence not only just to reach her goals, but also to adapt them to the expectations put on women at the time. She pivoted from a passion of archaeology to a profession, which was teaching, and this still allowed her to explore history and human behavior in whatever means she could do, right? So her ability to bridge disciplines between history, psychology, and education, if we think about it, this gave her something really rare: the ability to think in terms of interactive narratives. This was long before computers were used to tell a story, actually. So it's almost like as if her mind worked like an interactive narrative game before computer games even existed. And she didn't just love history or read about it or teach it. She used her knowledge to benefit her community around her. She served on history and book committees, for example. She wrote and published historical articles. And she helped launch an oral history collection. And she co-authored 2 local history books as well for her little community that she was in. So, what does all of this have to do with Sumerian Game? Well, next let's talk about how Mabel became involved in designing it and what the game was even trying to do in the first place. Because without Mabel, Sumerian Game might have just ended up a boring simulation of economics and maths, something like playing games on a calculator basically. And no, not a fancy graphical one that you can run Doom on, like just a calculator, just numbers. But thanks to Mabel, what we got instead was something very different, an engaging and imaginative new way to experience history by playing it. Alright, well, let's get into how Sumerian Game was made a little bit. What's the background of this game then? So, for Mabel, this strange opportunity began to take shape in around 1962. And why do I call it strange? Well, try looking at this through Mabel's eyes. You're a school teacher working in a very small school district, in a very small village school, basically, right? And computers, on the other hand, they are multi-million-dollar corporate military machines. Yeah, they're room-sized, they're climate-controlled, they're incredibly expensive. And they represented the absolute cutting edge of technology, science, and applied mathematics. If this happened today, it would be like a 4th-grade teacher from a small village with a passion for history being asked to design a game for a quantum computer, except without graphics, without screens, and without sound. Everything was printed in text and numbers back then. So even that comparison is almost easier than what she actually did, though. I mean, today we'd at least have a concept of computers as creative tools, right? But in 1962, there was no concept of video games. Interacting with computers meant punch cards. Computers did one thing, and one thing only. They calculated. The idea they could be used for anything else would have been met with some real skepticism. So let's look at this through the lens of video game history as well. So when the idea for what became Sumerian Game took shape in 1962, that was 10 years before even Pong, right? So Mabel wasn't stepping into a video game industry. That thing didn't even exist yet. There was no industry. She was helping invent the very idea that this is something worth doing in the first place. She is part of the reason the industry was born, as a matter of fact. So if we start talking about every game that existed around this time in any detail whatsoever, we'd get like super sidetracked, okay? But let's do a quick name drop, so that will help us set the scene for what video game technology looked like at the time. So from 1958, there was Tennis for Two by Willie Higginbotham, and that was played on an oscilloscope, which is basically an analog computer made for electricity signals. It was more like a physics demo that you could play, if that makes sense. Only one ever existed though, and it was dismantled roughly a year later. And then of course, we also had Space War, which was also created in the same year that the opportunity for the Sumerian Game came around. So that was in 1962. And Space War was created by Stephen Russell, also known as Slug, and that is widely considered the first digital video game. And certainly it was the very first to be widely distributed around universities as well. So hopefully this gives you some sense of just how early this actually was in terms of video games, and how little precedent there was when Mabel became involved in designing and writing for a video game. There was basically nothing else around. She was stepping into a dark room trying to design a video game. So then what was actually going on here in 1962? Well, rural schools and small school districts were facing somewhat of a crisis, so they were facing growing pressure to modernize their aging curriculum. So they didn't have any resources to do that, however. But in Westchester County, the superintendent of the Board of Cooperative Educational Services, Dr. Noble Givenden, had an idea. The Katona Lewisboro School District, where Mabel taught, was part of the system. Dr. Noble wondered whether they could use computers to be used as teaching tools in elementary schools. And to explore this, they partnered together with IBM. And if you're wondering why IBM actually, well, it was mostly because their office was just really close by, and that's basically the whole reason to it. So Dr. Noble invited 10 teachers, including Mabel, to come along with him to a workshop with IBM where they together explored how simulation games might be brought into classrooms. Now, the idea of using computer games for education wasn't completely unheard of at this point, though, to be honest. So, games were one of the most straightforward ways to get people engaged with computers in the first place, especially at a time when using a computer was still very technical and probably super intimidating for people as well. And it was already obvious to many that computers were definitely the future, so there was real incentive to get people accustomed to using them, right? But these games that already existed from computers, they probably aren't what you're imagining, let me tell you. So they were kind of like business management games for adults, and they dealt with things like resource management principles and systems and numbers in, numbers out. They had no story, there was no plot. The computer was being used as a really expensive calculator, basically. It's not something that we'd call a video game nowadays, even me who likes to call video games video games. There were simulation games, and we're really pushing it at this point. I mean, if maths homework to you is like a video game, then sure, these were video games, but if not, then no. These business management simulators were very much not video games, okay? Anyway, runs over. So Dr. Noble was already aware of these business management simulation games, and he was curious whether IBM could do something similar, but aimed at elementary school students instead, right? So during the workshop, in total, there was around 8 different teaching topics that were suggested. And from IBM's side, the workshop was led by Bruce Moncrief. So Bruce had an idea. So he was thinking, let's teach basic economic theory by simulating an entire civilization. But remember, this is still in the context of those business management games I just spoke about, right? Where the computer was still just used as a very advanced and expensive calculator. Although in Bruce's defense, he wasn't completely blind to the fact that for elementary students, yeah, you should probably make the game a little bit fun instead, otherwise, yeah, they're not going to pay attention and it simply wasn't going to work. And it was also Bruce's idea to take an ancient Sumerian civilization as the setting, because he felt that schools actually tended to gloss over anything that came before the Greeks. So a lot of this was actually put in the ballpark from Bruce Moncrief at the start, actually, rather than Mabel. But at this point, Dr. Richard Wing, the curriculum research coordinator of the board, asked the 10 teachers a very simple question. How do you think simulation could be used to teach your students? And this is where Mabel Addis now really started to take the idea and make it something tangible, drawing on her background as a passionate historian. So she proposed to expand on Bruce's idea and really run with it. After all, it was the Sumerian civilization that is often credited with inventing writing, inventing the wheel, creating a counting system, and even the first to map stars into constellations. This really wasn't just a setting to Mabel. She knew this was a birthplace of systems, of record keeping, and structured society itself. So she really got into this idea, right? And they gave this early concept a working nickname, the Sumerian play. But this is where the proverbial school bell rang and the workshop came to an end, because at this point, let's not forget that Dr. Noble Givenden and the Board of Cooperative Educational Services in Westchester County didn't actually have any money or resources to make any of this a reality just yet. Following this joint workshop, though, between IBM and Westchester County, Westchester would go on to apply for a grant from the U.S. Office of Education. So the idea was to continue exploring a joint venture between themselves and IBM over the course of 18 months. And that grant was approved, and they were awarded $100,000, which is $1 million in today's money. Wow, inflation, huh? I mean, I'm looking at you, Gabby, but I know you've got a weak voice. It's okay. You don't have to agree. 2 thumbs up, yeah, that's totally true. Cool. So, with funding secured, now the project began properly, and that was in February of 1963. And now several ideas from that previous workshop were officially approved to move forward. And among them was the concept that had emerged most strongly, which was the Sumerian play. And in the end, it was only Sumerian play that made it through into full development. And now this is where Mabel Addis truly steps into the history of this game. She was put in charge of designing the game in full. No pressure, Mabel, you got this. And IBM assigned one of their programmers, William McKay, to work with her to develop the game. And with that, a school teacher with a passion for history found herself designing something that had never really existed before. So to wrap this up a little bit, the original idea wasn't entirely Mabel's. It was actually built on Bruce Moncrief's idea of an economic simulation game to take place in ancient Sumer. Mabel alone now was responsible for fully designing the game though, right? So that was fully on her now. Sadly, the game has actually been lost, so we only have fragments of code left, screenshots, and magazine articles. But we know how to piece together how it worked. So, how was the game played? Before the game even started, the player witnessed what is now considered the first video game cutscene ever made. And no, it was not skippable. Let's not forget that graphics and computer screens didn't actually exist yet, so this was actually done by synchronizing a slideshow with a pre-recorded cassette tape. So yeah, this was also before PowerPoint, of course, haha. The cutscene contains your in-game advisors of the court to set the scene for the player. If there's anything that video games and good education share, after all, it's this. Immersion matters. So as for the actual gameplay itself then, okay? The player takes place of the ruler of the ancient Sumerian city of Lagash around 3500 BC. The game was split into 3 different segments. In the first, you are the ruler, Luduga I, and in the second, Luduga II, and in the third, well, you guessed it, Luduga III. So you can think of these segments as chapters, but the game itself was actually played in rounds, and the rounds represented seasons. I think this is most easily to compare to Civilization actually at this point. Anyway, commands for the game were entered into an IBM 1050 terminal. So what did this look like? You can picture a keyboard attached to a printer and you exactly think about how this thing looked like. And that terminal, so that was connected to an IBM 7090 mainframe computer. But what does the player actually do in the game? Well, you're given a whole lot of information about your city of Lagash. After all, this was supposed to teach economics. So what happens is that in a text-based style, you have an in-game steward that is speaking to you, and they let you know how many resources you have. Things like the amount of grain you have, how big your population is, how much land is under cultivation, that kind of stuff. And the steward then asks you to make some resource management decisions to keep your kingdom healthy. So you might tell the steward something like, I want to use 5 bushels of grain to feed my people. I want to plant 10,000 bushels of grain for the next crop and put 76 of grain into storage. I mean, those numbers are completely made up. I don't think that was realistic at all, but this is basically what you told the steward to do. So once you've made your decisions, the steward then ensures that your royal commands are set in motion, of course, and in the next round, a new season begins, and you get a brand new status report from your loyal steward. And of course, it's going to be based entirely on what your decisions were previously, right? So, I don't know about you, but me at this point, I could already see the danger of this turning into like a really boring game, similar to those business management simulation games we talked about earlier. But of course, Mabel made sure that this would not happen. Because something really important to note here is that this game was continually being improved and expanded on by Mabel as the designer. This wasn't simply a case of let's program it once and then you're done. Even the first iteration of the game felt a little bit dry, even with the cutscenes and our loyal Stewart character in place already. So, the game was played by students for the very first time in 1965. And this is where Mabel now really starts to shine as a full-fledged video game designer, because she really went beyond what had been done before by anyone else here. Mabel personally playtested the game with her very own students, and she was carefully noting the exact moments down where she felt her students started to lose interest in playing the game. And that feedback led to a major rewrite of the scripts for the game. So Mabel reduced repetition, adding more media through the slideshow and audio cassette cutscenes, and just adding more things for the player to engage with in general. So this process of playtesting, reworking, and repeating, that was a brand new idea at the time for games, by the way, as well, right? As if the Sumerian game actually deserves any more firsts, right? So we have the first real edutainment game, the first cutscene, the first strategy game, the first game with an actual storyline. The game was the first to do so many things, actually. It's really hard to keep on track of it, right? So, if I'm being honest, we've actually purposefully kept the more recognizable video game elements of Sumerian Game a little hidden until now, but it's about time we get them out into the open, because this is where we can actually explain properly how Mabel, through her ambitious, consistent improvements based on her students' feedback, turned what could have been an education gimmick into like an actual real video game. So in between the in-game rounds, which represented the seasons, when your steward delivers a status report on your previous resource management decisions, you could now suddenly be hit with several different random events that you're going to have to deal with. These were designed to mimic the unpredictability of real life, and it forced players to really think now to keep the kingdom alive. These variables included things like floods or fires that could leave you with fewer resources to work with. And what's really cool, these events weren't delivered in a dry, matter-of-factly kind of way, like you have lost 50 resources due to a fire. No, they were told in like a really rich and immersive way, like, Luduga, I fear that the people have angered our god Ningrisa. He alone could have sent that fire across the fields to destroy half of your crops. This is a very serious loss. I trust that you can cover it from your inventory. But there is no voice acting, of course. This was all text, yes. But Mabel added more. Independent from these disasters, there was also a certain amount of grain that would be lost from things like rotting and infesting rats eating away all of your crop. But there was still more. Because Mabel really seemed to have channeled and spoke to the gods of video games here. She was like the prophet imparting on us epic video games, okay? If you are consistently making good moral decisions and showing good judgment as a ruler, you'd be rewarded with technological innovations that could help you protect your resources, which is, something we've been very accustomed to now in RPGs, for example, right? Making the right decision gives you a better reward compared to being an evil person. Usually, anyway. But all of this was still just a part of the first segment of the game where you play as Luduga I. In the second segment of the game where you play as Luduga II, the game expands even further, with a new system being introduced, which not only increases the difficulty, but also the depth of the economic theory that the game was trying to teach you. Although I bet the game was so much fun though, I have a hard time imagining that the students actually realized they were learning at this point. As the second segment begins, your resources are reset to preset levels. And this isn't just to stop you from riding high on your previous success as a ruler, but actually to emphasize that some time has passed since the last segment. A new resource is now added, workers, and these can be allocated to developing crafts that can lead to technological innovations, where the first segment was actually all about grain, lands, and population. The second made the player think more about labor and specialization of Lagash. And then the third segment went even deeper by adding trade and expansion to your choices that you have to make as well. So, when Mabel designed Sumerian Game, she wasn't just outlining the bare mechanics as probably most other people would have done had they been in her position with, let's make a civilization game to, have some economic theory, give them a few resources and a population, and then they need to split those resources out into feeding and storage, and then based on their decisions, let's repeat this process over and over and over again until they see that, oh, you need to feed your people in order to have a surplus of food, that kind of stuff, the boring stuff. She wrote the narrative, she structured the gameplay rounds, and embedded historical context directly into the game. She shaped the decision points through historical relevant crises like crop failures and the consequences of the player's choices. And by doing this, she created the first interactive storytelling experience in computing. But only in recent years is she actually slowly getting any credit that she rightfully deserves for her pioneering contributions to video game development. There is a 1966 article from Life magazine that describes how the students played Sumerian Game, and it says, "They love being king and become genuinely involved. When the machine relentlessly types out the deaths resulting from an insufficient ration of food, they have been known to pound the keyboards and cry loud, 'No, don't let it happen! Please don't let it happen!'" That's a quote from Life magazine, by the way. So the game inspired a large amount of offshoot games as well, in what actually turns out to be a very complex family tree and timeline that we won't be able to get into today though. So it can't be understated how massively impactful Mabel's influence was on creating the video game. She truly turned this into an actual video game and not an education gimmick, using the computer as a calculator to make some business decisions. So what happened after Sumerian Game, then, you might wonder? Well, Mabel retired from teaching in 1976, but I am happy to tell you that she did visit Greece to see the Acropolis in the end, and also explored the ruins of Pompeii. There was clearly no stopping her from doing that, no matter what society was telling her when she was younger. When she returned from her travel, she even gave slideshows to her local community, and sharing those places with people that did not have a chance to travel themselves. She would not be involved in video game development after Sumerian Game, but by then she was the first video game writer, the first female game designer, the first one to bore us with unskippable cutscenes, and the first to trick us into actually learning through video games. So, if anything, she probably thought it was only polite to leave a few achievements for other game designers to accomplish. Her first husband, Alexander, passed away in 1981, and that's just 1 year shy of their 40th wedding anniversary. In 1991, she married Gerard Murgard, who sadly passed away in 1995, and Mabel Addis herself died from complications of Alzheimer's on August 13, 2004, in Westchester County. She was 92 years old. She remained a deeply loved person in her community throughout her life, and according to the New York Times, her only child, Alexandra Johnson, remembers her mother as a playful educator who made history come alive. At the 2023 Game Developers Conference, she posthumously received the Pioneer Award, honoring her breakthrough success, formally recognizing a breakthrough that quietly shaped video games from the very, very beginning. And of course, the Gaming History Club is happy to name her as Level 100 Legendary Gaming History Hero, and I hope you enjoyed this episode, Player One. So that concludes the episode, and now let's just quickly get out the news that we talked about earlier. So, Gabby and I will release episodes on the last Wednesday of every month for what's likely going to be the better part of 2026. But we're going to hopefully get back to doing it every second Wednesday as we're used to, as quickly as possible. We only have some career stuff that we want to get out of the way right now, but our true heart and soul lies in Gaming History Club. If we could do, we'd only be doing this, but sadly, live admin is also needing to be done sometimes. So, Gabby, come on, let's, have you bring us back out as, tradition states, please.
Oh, hi. Okay, I'm back. Hello.
Hello, Miss Sickly.
Thank you, JP, for doing the entire episode today.
Our fans are going to absolutely hate me right now. Like, oh, I'm so sick of him talking.
No, it's great. So, thank you for that. But yes, Player One, even though we're not coming back in 2 weeks' time, make sure you still talk to us. You still communicate with us because we're still here. So if you have any stories you want us to read out on our next episode, please do so. Write to us on gaminghistory.club and make sure you also subscribe and follow us on our social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook as Gaming History Club.
So, Gabby, thank you very much for your outroduction, even though you're desperately ill and need to go back to bed. And you, Player One, come back on the 25th of February because this is going to be perfectly in time for the release of Resident Evil Requiem, and we'll be covering the exciting history of this awesome franchise for you guys just before the game drops. So, see ya!